Like metallic rain falling on a city of neon dreams, our stories are both beautiful and piercingly cold to the touch. Experience the raw intensity of urban drama through a unique and cinematic lens of high-tech art. Click subscribe now and feel every drop of the narrative.
The call came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. My brother didn't say hello. He never did. "I need you out by Friday," he said. "Natalie wants to convert your room into a home office." I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall. I had lived in that house for 3 years, ever since our parents died within 8 months of each other, since the estate lawyer read the will, and my brother Marcus walked out of that office, looking like he'd won the lottery. Because he had. The house in Scottsdale. The investment accounts. The car. Everything that had a number attached to it went to Marcus. What I got was a storage unit in Tempe, a 10 by 20 climate-controlled box on the edge of an industrial park, registered in my name, containing, according to the estate documents, miscellaneous personal effects and workshop materials belonging to the deceased. Our father's junk. That's what Marcus called it when he was in a generous mood. When he wasn't, he called it garbage. "Friday," I said. "That's 3 days. Natalie already picked out the furniture. The desk gets delivered Saturday morning." He paused. "I'll have Jorge box up your stuff." Jorge was their housekeeper. He was 62 years old and had a bad knee. "Don't have Jorge do anything," I said. "I'll come Thursday." Marcus hung up without responding. I set my phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree in materials science, a job I liked at a testing lab in Chandler, and approximately $11,000 in savings. I had been paying my brother $300 a month to sleep in the bedroom I grew up in the house my parents paid off before they died. Marcus had refinanced it 6 weeks after the will cleared probate. I had never asked him why he needed the money. I already knew. Natalie had expensive taste and Marcus had expensive pride, and together they burned through money the way a dry field burns in August. Thursday came. I packed my clothes, my books, my mother's cast iron skillet, and the photograph from my parents' 25th anniversary that I'd kept on my dresser for 3 years. Marcus was at work. Natalie was somewhere in the house. I could hear her on a call, laughing at something. She didn't come out to say goodbye. I loaded everything into my car and drove to a friend's apartment in Mesa, where I slept on an air mattress in the living room, and tried to figure out what came next. What came next, I decided, was the storage unit. I had been paying $38 a month for 3 years and never once gone inside. The estate lawyer had handed me a key and a document, and I had put both in a drawer and tried not to think about them. It felt like opening that door would mean something I wasn't ready for, that it would make final something I was still pretending wasn't, but I needed a place to stay. And the unit was climate-controlled. And it was mine. I drove out on a Saturday morning in early October, when the Phoenix heat had finally broken enough to be bearable. The industrial park was quiet. A few semi-trucks idled near a loading dock on the far end. Pigeons walked along a concrete wall. The whole place smelled like motor oil and dust, and the particular emptiness of spaces nobody thinks about. My unit was in the second row. Number 114. I stood in front of the roll-up door for a moment with the key in my hand, and then I crouched down and unlocked the padlock and lifted. The door rattled up and the smell hit me first. Not bad. No rot or mildew. Something dry and metallic, like old tools and machine oil, and something else underneath that I couldn't name. Something that reminded me, suddenly and completely, of being 8 years old and standing in the doorway of my father's workshop, watching him work without understanding what he was doing. I reached for the light switch just inside the door frame. A single fluorescent tube flickered and buzzed to life. The unit was packed floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Wooden shelves, built by hand, holding rows of cardboard boxes that had been labeled in my father's handwriting. Parts, tools, documentation. Reference, MISC. In the center of the floor, covered by canvas tarps, were several large shapes I couldn't immediately identify. I walked to the nearest shelf and opened a box marked documentation. Inside, in plastic sleeves, were papers, certificates, receipts, letters on business letterhead. I pulled one out and looked at it. It was a receipt from a watchmaker in Geneva, dated 1987, for something I didn't recognize by name, but the price at the bottom, even adjusted for nothing, even just the raw number, made me stop. $12,000. In 1987, I put the receipt down carefully and turned to the shapes in the middle of the floor. I lifted the corner of the nearest tarp. Underneath was a watch case, a large one, glass-fronted, the kind you see in museums, or very serious collectors' shops. Inside, laid out on dark velvet, were watches, dozens of them. Dress watches, pocket watches, a few divers' watches, chronographs with small dials inside the main dial. Each one tagged with a small paper label in my father's handwriting. I stood there for a long time without moving. My father had been a quiet man, an engineer by training and by temperament, someone who found most conversation unnecessary and most people exhausting. He had a workshop in the garage that my mother called his cave, and he disappeared into it most evenings after dinner. I had always assumed he was tinkering, fixing things, building things. He'd repaired the dishwasher twice, rewired a lamp, built a bookshelf that was still in the living room of the house Marcus now owned. I had never once thought to ask what he was doing the rest of the time. I pulled the tarp fully off the first case. Then I moved to the next one. There were 4 cases in total. I didn't count the watches that day. I sat on the floor of that storage unit for 3 hours opening boxes and reading my father's handwriting and slowly beginning to understand that the man I thought I knew had a whole interior life I had never seen. The documentation boxes contained purchase records, service histories, provenance papers, correspondence with dealers and auction houses, and collectors in Switzerland, England, Japan. Some of the letters were decades old. Some were more recent, dated just 2 years before he got sick, when he was still driving himself to appointments and pretending he was fine. He had never told anyone. Not my mother. As far as I could tell, there were no letters addressed to her, no notes that mentioned her reaction, nothing to suggest she had known. Not Marcus. Certainly not me. He had built this in silence, over 40 years, and then he had died and left it to me inside a document that described it as miscellaneous personal effects and workshop materials. Either he trusted me to figure it out, or he knew Marcus would have sold it immediately and wanted to make sure that didn't happen. I chose to believe it was both. That afternoon I drove to the library and sat at a computer for 4 hours. I looked up every name I could read in the documentation boxes. I cross-referenced watch references with auction records. I found a database of historical sales and started entering the model numbers from my father's labels. I am a materials scientist. My entire job is systematic investigation. I take an unknown substance, and I subject it to tests, until it tells me what it is and what it can do. I build a methodology. I document everything. I don't guess. I stopped thinking like a daughter who had just lost her father all over again. I stopped feeling the specific grief of discovering you didn't know someone as well as you thought. I spent the next 3 weeks doing nothing else. I cataloged every piece, photographed everything against a neutral background, using a macro lens I borrowed from a colleague at work, cross-referenced every reference number with historical production data, pulled the provenance papers and verified them against public auction records. Some of the pieces I could identify immediately from database entries, production numbers, historical sales, current market estimates. Others required more work. I emailed 2 horological societies using careful, non-specific language, asking general questions about particular references. I did not tell Marcus any of this. I did not tell anyone. When I had enough information to feel confident, I reached out to a specialist at Heritage Auctions in Dallas. I explained that I had inherited a collection and wanted to discuss consignment. I was careful about what I shared. I sent photographs of 3 pieces, not the rarest ones, not the most significant ones, just 3 that were clearly legitimate and clearly valuable enough to demonstrate I wasn't wasting anyone's time. The specialist called me back within 48 hours. Her name was Carol, and she had been working in the department for 19 years. And she asked me, in a voice that was professionally composed but not entirely able to hide its interest, if I would be available to bring the collection in for a formal evaluation. "How many pieces are we talking about?" she asked. 87, I said. "That I've cataloged so far. There are a few I haven't been able to fully identify." There was a pause. "Can I ask," she said carefully, "how long this collection has been in storage?" My father acquired pieces over approximately 40 years. The most recent purchase I can document was about 2 years before his death. Another pause. "We'd love to see it," she said. I drove to Dallas with the collection packed in archival cases I had researched and purchased specifically for transport. I checked into a hotel that cost more than I usually spent in a week, and I didn't let myself think about the number. I had done the preliminary math enough times to know the risk was acceptable. Carol met me in a conference room on the 14th floor. She had brought 2 colleagues. They put on cotton gloves before they touched anything. I sat in the corner and watched them work, and I didn't say anything until they were ready to talk. They were ready to talk after about 2 hours. The collection, Carol told me, was remarkable. Not just in terms of individual pieces, though there were several that were individually significant, but in terms of what my father had apparently understood about where the market was going. He had concentrated in references that were, at the time of acquisition, undervalued or overlooked, and had acquired documentation that made provenance verification straightforward. He had not been collecting for display or for status. He had been collecting the way a certain kind of engineer collects. Systematically, patiently, with a very long horizon in mind. The preliminary estimate for the full collection was between $4 and $6 million. The two rarest pieces, a particular pocket watch from the 1920s and a chronograph that had a documented history Carol described as exceptional, were estimated individually at just under $1 million combined. I thanked her and told her I would be in touch about next steps, and I walked out of the building and sat in my rental car in the parking garage and cried for about 10 minutes. Not from happiness, exactly, though that was in there. From something more complicated. From the feeling of receiving a message from someone who could no longer speak to you directly. From the understanding that my father, in his silence, had been saying something this whole time, and that what he'd been saying was, "I see you. This is for you. I knew you'd figure it out." I went back to Phoenix and called a probate attorney. I brought the estate documents, the storage unit lease, and every piece of documentation from the collection. I needed to understand, precisely and completely, what was mine. The attorney read everything carefully, and then looked up at me. "This was conveyed to you outright," she said. "No conditions, no shared ownership, no right of first refusal for any other party. The unit contents transferred to you on the date of probate. Everything in it was yours from that moment. Even if my brother didn't know what was in there? Legally irrelevant," she said. "What matters is what the document says, and what the document says is that the storage unit and its contents belong to you." I sat with that for a moment. What if someone were to claim they had an interest in the contents? Based on family relationship? Or on the idea that the estate was distributed unfairly? She leaned back. They could try. The will was not contested within the statutory period. The distribution was completed and probated. At this point, the path to any successful claim would be very narrow and very expensive, and would require demonstrating fraud or undue influence in the original will, which is, she paused, a very difficult standard to meet. I thanked her and wrote her a check for the consultation and left. I moved into a short-term rental apartment in Tempe. I kept paying my storage unit fees. I kept going to work every day at the testing lab. I told nobody what I was doing. Over the next 2 months, I worked with Carol at Heritage to prepare the collection for auction. I decided to sell in 2 stages, the 2 highest value pieces in a dedicated watches and horology auction in the spring, and the remainder in a broader collector's sale later in the year. The spring auction, Carol estimated, would bring somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million for those 2 pieces alone, depending on who showed up and how the bidding went. I also, during those 2 months, did something else. One of the documentation boxes contained a folder I had almost overlooked because it was labeled, in my father's handwriting, simply Correspondence Personal. Inside were about 30 letters, handwritten, exchanged between my father and a man named Howard, who had apparently been his closest friend before Howard moved to Oregon in the early 90s. Howard was, it turned out from the letters, a self-storage facility owner who had spent 20 years building a small chain of properties across the Pacific Northwest. I found Howard online. He was 74. He was still in the industry. His son now ran the day-to-day operations. I wrote him a letter, on paper, in an envelope. I introduced myself and told him I was Richard's daughter, and that I had found their correspondence in my father's storage unit, and that I hoped he was well. He called me 3 days later. We talked for 2 hours. He cried when I told him about the collection. He said he'd always known my father was building something. He'd just never known what. At the end of the call, Howard mentioned that his son was looking to sell one of their properties, a 12-unit self-storage facility in Flagstaff that had good bones, but needed operational attention. He wasn't soliciting me, he said. He just thought it was the kind of thing my father would have found interesting. I thought about my father's files, his systematic approach, his patience, his understanding that the things other people ignored were often exactly the things worth paying attention to. I told Howard I'd like to hear more about it. The spring auction went well, better than projected. The pocket watch drew a bidder from overseas who was not in the room, and the final price for that single piece was $640,000. The chronograph went for $480,000. Carol called me as soon as the hammer came down, and her voice had finally given up pretending to be composed. I was in my apartment in Tempe when she called. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and my father's letters spread out in front of me, because I had been reading them again, which I did sometimes when I needed to feel steady. "Your father," Carol said, "really knew what he was doing." "Yes," I said, "he did." The purchase of Howard's son's property closed 4 months after the spring auction. I retained an operations manager with 20 years of industry experience. I kept my job at the testing lab for another 2 months while things stabilized, and then I left on good terms and with a genuine thank you to my supervisor, who had been kind to me during a period when I had needed kindness without advertising the need. I had not spoken to Marcus in all of this time. He called me once, in February, to tell me that Jorge had found one of my books, a structural engineering textbook I'd used in a materials class years ago, when Natalie had reorganized the garage. Did I want it? I said yes. I'd come by to get it. When I arrived, Natalie was having her hair done in the kitchen by someone who came to the house, and Marcus showed me to the garage and handed me the book and asked, in the way he always asked things, which was not quite a question, and not quite an accusation, whether I had figured out the storage situation yet. It's fine, I said. I'm just saying, it costs money every month and there's nothing in there worth keeping. Dad's old junk. He shrugged. You could probably just clear it out and stop paying the fees. I looked at him for a moment. I'm handling it, I said. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and found it disappointing, and I got in my car and drove away. I want to be honest about the moment I decided to tell him. It wasn't vindictiveness exactly. I had thought about simply never saying anything, letting the auction results become public record, which they would eventually, and letting Marcus find out through whatever channel he found out through. I could have done that. The attorney had confirmed there was nothing he could do. I was under no obligation. But my father had kept secrets for 40 years, and I had watched what that did to the people around him, including me, and I did not want to be that person. I did not want to build my life on a foundation of deliberate silence towards someone I shared a childhood with, even a difficult one. So I called Marcus and told him I had something to show him. And he came to my apartment in Tempe on a Wednesday evening looking faintly puzzled, the way he always looked in spaces that weren't up to his standards. I had my laptop open on the kitchen table. I had pulled up the Heritage Auctions result page for the spring sale. I told him about the storage unit. I told him about the collection. I told him about the 40 years of documentation, the letters, the provenance, the systematic process of a quiet man building something in silence. I watched his face while I talked and I did not feel triumphant, exactly. I felt something quieter than that. When I finished, I turned the laptop toward him. He sat there for a long time. That was in the storage unit, he said finally. Not a question. In the storage unit, in Dad's boxes, labeled documentation and parts. For 40 years. At least that. Some of the purchase records go back further. He looked at the auction results on the screen. He looked at the number. He looked at me. I watched him work through it, the sequence of realizations, one after another, that our father had known, that it had been left to me intentionally, that the description in the estate documents had been technically accurate, that the statutory period for contesting the will had long passed, that there was nothing to be done. The Flagstaff property, I said. The self-storage facility I purchased. I named it after Dad's initials, RMK Storage. I paused. I thought you should know. He stood up. He put his jacket back on, which he'd draped over the back of the chair. He didn't look at me directly. You could have told me, he said. I let that sit for a second. You called it junk, I said. Twice. In my presence. And you told me to clear it out and stop paying the fees. He didn't answer that. At the door, he stopped. He always liked you better, he said. It came out with more weight than I think he intended, like something he'd been carrying for a long time and hadn't meant to set down here. I thought about my father in his workshop. His silence. The 40 years of letters and purchase records and documentation stored in a climate-controlled box that his son had dismissed without opening. He left you the house, I said. He left me the thing he loved most. I don't know how Marcus feels about that now. We are not close. We are in contact, occasionally, the way you maintain contact with someone you share a history with, even when the history is complicated, and the present is mostly distance. What I know is this. The Flagstaff facility is doing well. I am looking at a second property in Prescott. The remainder of the collection sold at the fall auction, and the total cleared, across both sales and all 87 pieces, just over $4.8 million. I have invested most of it carefully, in ways I researched methodically, in ways my father would have approved of. I kept one watch. A small dress watch. Steel case. Champagne dial. Not the most valuable piece in the collection by a significant margin. I kept it because when I looked at the purchase record, it was the earliest one in the folder. My father had bought it in 1981, 3 years before I was born. He had paid $240 for it, which was a lot of money then for a young engineer just starting out. He had kept it for over 40 years. He had serviced it regularly. He had kept the papers. He had never sold it. I wear it sometimes on days when I need to remember that patience is not the same as passivity. That building something slowly and quietly, without anyone watching, is still building. That the things other people walk past without looking are sometimes the things that matter most. That a storage unit in Tempe, climate-controlled, $38 a month, can hold 40 years of love in cardboard boxes waiting for the right person to open them. I was always the right person. He knew that. I know it now. And that is the whole story.